Max Verstappen finished second in first practice and fourth in second practice, yet his radio exposed a Red Bull that felt almost impossible to trust. He said the car felt like it was driving with the handbrake on, then reported rear axle locking, a front wing concern, and a seating position that left him feeling far too reclined. The shocking part is that he still remained within 7/10 of the fastest lap, and only 193 thousandths behind Lando Norris on his decisive soft tire run. So Red Bull does not simply have a speed problem. It may have something far more dangerous, a car with hidden performance that Verstappen cannot safely unlock. And his warning reveals why one unstable braking zone could destroy their entire Hungarian weekend. Subscribe to the channel. Friday practice should have given Red Bull a clear answer. Instead, it exposed a contradiction that became more dangerous with every lap. Max Verstappen finished second in the opening session. Charles Leclerc led for Ferrari with a lap of 1 minute, 19.075 seconds. Verstappen followed with a 1 minute, 19.559. The gap was 484 thousandths of a second. Less than half a second. That looked competitive. It looked like Red Bull had arrived in Hungary with enough pace to pressure Ferrari. It looked like Verstappen only needed a few small setup changes before the car became a serious threat. But the timing screen was hiding the real problem. Inside the cockpit, Verstappen did not feel as though he was driving the second fastest car. He felt as though something was holding it back. His description was brutally simple. The Red Bull felt like it was driving with the handbrake on. That message changed the meaning of the entire session. A handbrake does not only make a car slower. It creates resistance. It makes every movement feel heavier than it should. Acceleration becomes less natural. Rotation becomes more difficult. The driver feels as though the machine is fighting against him instead of moving with him. Imagine trying to sprint while someone grips the back of your shirt. You can still move quickly. You may even pass almost everyone around you. But every step requires more effort, and you know your real speed is being trapped. That was the disturbing part of Verstappen's complaint. He was already second. If the car still felt restrained, then Red Bull faced one of two uncomfortable possibilities. Either the RB22 had significantly more performance hidden inside it, or Verstappen was using his own ability to disguise how difficult the car had become. Both possibilities were dangerous. If the speed was hidden, Red Bull had to find a way to release it. If Verstappen was covering the weakness, the timing screen was giving the engineers a false sense of security. And that is where a great driver can make a team's problem harder to understand. A slower driver exposes a difficult car through the result. The lap time falls away. The weakness becomes obvious. Verstappen can do something very different. He can move his braking point. He can adjust his line. He can use the throttle more carefully. He can correct instability before most people even notice the car has moved. The final lap looks controlled. The fight underneath it remains hidden. That is why second place did not prove Red Bull had found the correct balance. It may only have proved Verstappen could survive the wrong one. And at the Hungaroring, survival is not enough. This circuit demands rhythm. One corner flows into another, then another. The driver does not have long straights after every turn to reset and recover. A small mistake follows him. A poor braking phase damages the corner entry. A weak entry affects the middle of the turn. A compromised middle creates a slower exit. Then the next corner arrives before the driver has fully escaped the first problem. It is like missing the first step while running up a staircase. You may not fall, but every movement after that becomes hurried. That is why horrible balance becomes so expensive in Hungary. The front of the car must respond immediately. The rear must stay stable while the driver brakes. The tires must give clear information. And the driver must be able to connect each movement without hesitation. Verstappen's handbrake comparison suggested that connection was already braking. He was not simply asking for more speed. He was asking for freedom inside the car. Freedom to brake later. Freedom to rotate the car without waiting. Freedom to press the throttle without feeling that the rear might resist or slide. Those are the tiny moments where lap time disappears. A driver does not need to make a visible mistake to lose several tenths. He only needs to hesitate. A fraction earlier on the brake. A fraction later on the throttle. A slightly wider line because the front does not respond. A small correction because the rear feels uncertain. Each loss seems almost meaningless. Across an entire lap, they become the gap. And Verstappen's radio suggested those losses were already accumulating. But there was another clue Red Bull could not ignore. The team was not using the distinctive rear wing it had tested 1 week earlier in Belgium, the design that had become known as the Macarena wing. The available information does not prove that removing the wing caused Verstappen's balance problem. There is no confirmed direct connection. But its absence showed that Red Bull was still searching. Still changing the car from one circuit to another. Still trying to understand which aerodynamic combination could give Verstappen speed without destroying stability. Belgium had created hope. Verstappen finished third there, behind Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. It was his third podium of the season. That result suggested Red Bull might finally be building momentum. Then Hungary began, and Verstappen immediately described a car that felt restrained. That contrast raised a much bigger question. Had Red Bull truly improved the RB22? Or had Belgium simply given the team a narrow setup that worked under one very specific set of conditions? True progress should travel. It should survive different circuits, different wing levels, different corner speeds, different braking demands, different tire behavior. If the improvement disappears as soon as the track changes, then the central problem has not been solved. It has only been hidden. And a narrow setup window is one of the most dangerous weaknesses a Formula One team can have. It means the car can be quick, but only when everything is exactly right. The correct temperature, the correct tire preparation, the correct ride height, the correct balance, the correct track conditions. Miss one detail, and the car changes. The front stops responding. The rear becomes unstable. The driver loses confidence. The performance disappears as quickly as it arrived. That possibility made Verstappen's second place far less comforting. Red Bull had visible speed. But visible speed is not always usable speed. Visible speed is one lap on the timing screen. Usable speed is performance the driver can access repeatedly, confidently, and under pressure. That is what qualifying requires. One committed lap. No hesitation. No safety margin. No time to negotiate with the car. Verstappen would need to brake later. Turn more aggressively. Use every inch of the circuit. Trust the front tires. Trust the rear axle. Trust that the car would behave exactly as expected when the tires reached their limit. The handbrake feeling suggested that trust was already damaged. And once trust disappears, the driver begins protecting the car. He brakes slightly earlier. He waits slightly longer. He leaves a margin. His talent becomes defense instead of attack. That is the opposite of what Red Bull needs from Verstappen. His greatest weapon is commitment. He attacks the limit because he believes he can control what happens there. But commitment requires predictability. Without predictability, aggression becomes risk. And this was only the opening session. Red Bull still had time to respond. The engineers could study the data. They could compare Verstappen's braking points. They could examine how the car transferred its weight. They could identify whether the front was refusing to rotate, whether the rear lacked stability, or whether both problems were appearing at different stages of the same corner. Second practice should have shown progress. It should have shown that Red Bull understood the warning. It should have given Verstappen a car that felt freer, sharper, and more connected. Instead, the problem became more specific. The handbrake feeling did not disappear. It evolved into something far more dangerous. Because when Verstappen returned to the radio in the afternoon, he was no longer describing a general lack of balance. He was warning Red Bull that the rear axle was locking under braking. Second practice was supposed to prove Red Bull had understood the morning warning. Instead, Verstappen's next message made the problem far more serious. Lewis Hamilton led the afternoon session for Ferrari with a lap of 1 minute, 18.729 seconds. Verstappen finished fourth. He was 692 thousandths behind. Again, that did not look like a complete collapse. He remained inside 7/10ths of the fastest time. On his decisive run with the soft tire, he was only 193 thousandths behind Lando Norris. At one stage, he even climbed to third place provisionally. The Red Bull still had speed. That was exactly what made the situation so uncomfortable. Because the faster the car looked, the more alarming Verstappen's radio became. At 6:51 in the evening, local time, he reported rear axle locking in the braking zones. That was not a vague complaint. It was not simply a driver saying the car felt difficult. It was a specific warning about what the rear of the car was doing when he tried to slow down. And that matters because braking is where trust is either created or destroyed. When a Formula One car approaches a corner, the driver presses the brake pedal with enormous force. The weight of the car moves forward. The front tires take more load. The rear becomes lighter. If the rear axle begins locking, the back of the car can become nervous. It can start sliding. It can begin rotating before the driver wants it to rotate. Imagine riding a bicycle and touching the rear brake too sharply while turning. The back wheel can move sideways. For one moment, the bicycle stops following the line you chose. Now imagine that uncertainty at Formula One speed. The driver cannot simply react after the rear moves. He must trust that it will not move unexpectedly in the first place. That is why rear axle locking attacks more than lap time. It attacks confidence. Once Verstappen feels the rear become unstable, he starts preparing for the possibility before the next corner even arrives. He brakes slightly earlier. He releases pressure more carefully. He turns in with less aggression. He waits before returning to the throttle. Each change protects the car. Each change also makes the lap slower. And at the Hungaroring, those losses do not remain isolated. A weak braking phase changes the corner entry. A compromised entry changes the middle of the turn. A poor middle creates a slower exit. Then the next corner arrives before the driver has fully escaped the original problem. The loss spreads. One unstable rear axle becomes several lost moments across the lap. That is why the afternoon complaint was much more dangerous than the morning handbrake comparison. In the morning, Verstappen described a general feeling of resistance. In the afternoon, he identified instability under braking. The language became more precise. The risk became easier to understand. But the source does not confirm one exact technical cause. It does not prove that every complaint came from the same component. What it does show is continuity. In both sessions, Verstappen lacked full confidence while braking and accelerating. The symptoms changed. The underlying discomfort remained. That was the warning Red Bull could not ignore. The engineers had already received the morning feedback. They had already made adjustments. They had already sent the car back onto the circuit. And the problem had survived. That is when a setup issue becomes more than a temporary inconvenience. It becomes a pattern. But rear axle locking was not the only concern Verstappen reported during the afternoon. 6 minutes earlier, at 6:45, he had mentioned an issue involving debris and the front wing. The exact technical details were not fully explained. There is no confirmed evidence of a major front wing failure. So it would be wrong to describe it as something more dramatic than the source supports. But the complaint still added another layer of uncertainty. The front wing helps the car turn. It affects how quickly the front responds when the driver moves the steering wheel. If the front does not behave naturally, the driver may turn in and feel the car hesitate. That hesitation can force him to add more steering. More steering creates more stress through the front tires. The tires can begin sliding. And once the front slides, the driver reaches the corner exit with less control. Now place that concern beside the rear axle locking. At the front, uncertainty. At the rear, instability. Verstappen was no longer managing one weakness. He was trying to understand what both ends of the car were doing. That is one of the clearest signs of poor balance. A balanced car gives the driver one connected movement. Brake, turn, accelerate. Each phase supports the next. An unbalanced car breaks that connection. The driver brakes, but the rear becomes nervous. He turns, but the front may not respond as expected. He accelerates, but the previous problems have already damaged the exit. The car stops feeling like one machine. It begins feeling like several different problems arriving at once. And then came another complaint. Verstappen said he felt as though he was lying down too much in the seat. At first, that may sound less serious than rear axle locking. It is not. A Formula One driver sits extremely low inside the chassis. His legs stretch forward. His shoulders are fixed tightly in place. His head is surrounded by protective structures. The seating position affects how he sees the track. It affects how he reaches the steering wheel.